Today is Tuesday, December 29, 1992. I am Janice Kettler, interviewing Helga Relations for the Oregon Holocaust Resource Center Oral History Project. We are at the Portland Jewish Academy in Portland, Oregon. Assisting with the interview today is Eric Harper. Good morning. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here.
I'd like you to begin by telling us your full name and the spelling, including your maiden name, and then the date and place of your birth.
All right. My full name is Helga, no middle name, relation, my married name.
Married.
I was born Helga Bernstein.
Can you spell that?
Bernstein, Bernstein. And I was born in Berlin, Germany, 24th of February, 1924.
Thank you. Can you tell us who lived in your household, who was in your family before the war began or at the time of your birth?
Okay. Actually, I have no brothers and sisters, and I lived with my parents in an apartment, a very big apartment. I had my mother's parents were still alive, and so was my father's mother. But they all lived in different areas. But they all lived in Berlin. We were a long family of Berlin citizens. We had been there many, many years. We were real German as far as that's concerned. We didn't come from another country. My ancestors didn't come from another country. So that we felt very German, needless to say. I was born in Berlin, and I went to school in Berlin. My father had his own business. It was a business of, a wholesale business of silk and satins and velvets. The people who bought materials from him were film companies where they made the costumes, etc. It was a very good going business because he took it over from his father, and he was sent to France to learn the business. And my mother came from a fairly wealthy family, so that she had a mademoiselle who taught her French, and she also had an English miss who taught her English. So my parents spoke both English and French at home, which was sometimes kind of funny because if they didn't want me to understand anything, they spoke in a different language. But eventually I learned that too. So I really had a fairly decent life and didn't really know anything about things until maybe in the 1930s, because I went to grade school, and from grade school I went into a high school. Now, the high school I have to explain a little bit, because it was a Catholic convent high school, a very, very excellent school. In those days, Hitler had already come to power, and Jews basically were not allowed to go to those kind of schools unless their father, the father of the child, happened to have been in the First World War and won the Iron Cross, which my father had. Therefore, I was privileged to be able to make my entrance examination at this school, which was also due to friends of ours. And I passed the examination and went to school. And there were some other Jewish children, but very few. The rest of them were nuns and priests, but we did have our own religious instructions. We had, it wasn't a rabbi, but it was a Jewish teacher who came in, and while the others had their religious training, we had our Jewish religious training. So it wasn't a question of that, we were being converted in any way or form. However, I did learn an awful lot about Catholics and of course read a lot of books, which became quite interesting in my later life. But it was a wonderful school. The nuns were fabulous. There was absolutely no anti-Semitism whatsoever, because basically Catholic people were also persecuted, and so their life and their philosophy, of course, is quite different than anybody else's. They take people as they are. The friends that I had, except for one or two, were non-Jewish, obviously, because I was in a school that didn't have a lot of Jewish children. And the school was so good that actually in America it would be considered, the things that I learned would be considered actually of 2 years of college, because we had just about everything that you can possibly take in college here today, which was not, what would you call it, you couldn't choose, you had to take these classes. So I learned English, French, German, mathematics, all of mathematics, trig, whatever. Actually, until the year 1933-34, I believe that Hitler came to power. Really came to power, because Hindenburg died, the president died, and Hitler came to power. And we had to, you had to vote, and the voting meant that when you voted, you practically had a gun at your head, because you had to vote for Hitler. You had no choice. You had to vote for Hitler.
Could you explain more about that?
Well, I only remember that my parents went voting, and there were people Nazis standing there saying, you have to vote for Hitler. There obviously was another, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a Socialist Democratic Party, but the fact was that you had to vote for Hitler. You had to. There was no choice. You had a gun at your head if you didn't. If you didn't vote for Hitler, it wasn't quite as democratic as it is here. You had to vote.
Do you think that the voting was open so they could see who people were voting
I
for?
don't remember that. I really couldn't tell you about that. I do know that it was a must. It was very, very obvious. It was a must. You had to. This is why my feeling about voting in the United States, I feel particularly strongly about that, because I feel that people who don't vote are not really doing what they should be doing. It's something that's a privilege, and I think a lot of people in the United States don't realize what a privilege it really is to be able to go out and vote and say and do whatever they want to do without anybody telling you what to do and how to do it. Well, anyway,
I would like to backtrack a little bit before Hitler's rise to power and ask you some more things about your family. if that's
Okay.
all right. What kind of Jewish observance or religious Jewish observance did the family?
Very little, I'm afraid to say. My parents were very liberal, and I did go to a synagogue, but I only went during the days that were very important. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, very, very little. I don't believe that my mother had great religious training at all. My father had a little bit more, and of course, Yom Kippur, they always fasted. That was the one thing that they did. But basically, in general, I really didn't have much of a Jewish upbringing that I would call a Jewish upbringing. I knew I was Jewish. I never denied the fact that I was Jewish, but it was not what you might call a real Jewish home until much later.
What about their friends?
Their friends were almost all Jewish, I would say. There were Jewish friends, there were, of course, business friends. And the majority of people that I can think of were Jewish. So
What about the apartment building where you lived?
the apartment building was a lovely apartment building in a very lovely neighborhood, and we were the only Jews in the whole apartment building, the only ones. And since we were rather quiet, we were very well accepted. There was no, in fact, we had a Nazi living in our apartment building who always wore the uniform, always. And we used to call him Crooked Legs because he was so crooked, but he always said Heil Hitler, and we never answered. But he knew we were Jewish, but it didn't seem to, make any impression of any kind.
What was the synagogue like that you attended on the major holidays?
It was a lovely synagogue. It was what you most probably call here liberal. A liberal synagogue, very nice. An old synagogue, which of course got destroyed during Kristallnacht. And I did get to see it again after it got rebuilt when I went to Berlin, but I can tell you about that later on. But it was one of the main synagogues in Berlin, in the west end of Berlin. And like I said, I only went, certain times. So I can't honestly say that I had a real Jewish upbringing as you think of today.
In grade school, before you entered high school, was that a public
Yes,
school?
that was a public school. Yes, it was a public school. Tell you the truth, I don't really remember an awful lot about it. My father used to take me to school, and I got picked up. I didn't walk by myself most of the time. You don't go to grade school very long. You jump into high school practically immediately. I think I only went 4 years, less than 4 years, to the grade school. And then if you can afford to, you then go to a different kind of school. If you're in the situation that you can't afford it, then children continue to go to school till they're 14. They graduate at 14 and then go to a trade school. That is the way it used to be. Other children go then.
How old were you then when you entered the Catholic high school?
Let's see. I have to think. Must have been about 11, 10 to 11, somewhere in that vicinity.
So in about
Sechster,
1934?
Quinter, Quarter, Untertertiär, Obertertiär, 5 years. Let's see, I left in 39. Yes, somewhere around that, 1934. Yes, I would say definitely.
Were your parents involved in any kind of political activity?
No, none whatsoever. None whatsoever.
No Zionistic activity
No,
either?
no, none whatsoever.
Okay. And when did you first become aware of Nazis and Hitler? When in your life as a child, can you remember approximately what year?
Well, actually, I really grew up with it because Hitler started in 1924, and by the time that he was really powerful, it had been going on all along. And so basically I grew up with it. I mean, it was there, it was there, but it wasn't as predominant as when you're a child, you don't think that much about it. You know it's there, but you don't pay that much attention. And when you're very young, you really don't. You know you're Jewish, but you don't. You sort of ignore things if they don't touch you personally. You know what I mean?
Did your parents discuss it very much at home?
Did they what?
Did they discuss Hitler's rise to power?
Yes, they did. I do remember one of the incidents that was very, very scary. When you go to school, you have to buy your own books and all your own notebooks and things like that. People who cannot afford it don't have to do that. They get it from the school. One of the situations was that a girl that lived across the street from me, her parents were what we call caretakers of the apartment. Everybody has caretakers in the apartment they live. Not very educated. They're people who take care of them like they do here, only a little different. It's a little different. People don't look upon them as, it's a class distinction. Let's put it that way. And of course, when Hitler came to power, the people that had the least amount of money were, of course, the people who were most affected by it, because they were told all the time that it was the fault of the Jews that they were poor. It was the fault of the Jews that that they didn't have much money, and so of course they believed that. It was at a time when Germany was not in very good shape, and you know very well that when people always seem to pick on somebody, or they have to have a scapegoat, and of course the Jews was a scapegoat, as we all know. This girl, and one of the things was that people wore little swastikas on their, they managed to buy these little swastikas that they make sure that you know that they are.
Was it made out of fabric, or was
No,
it pins?
they were pins.
Pins.
Yes. And I will never forget. I guess I didn't like the girl. I can't remember, but she came in one day with a swastika, great big swastika, and I was still in my grade school. And she always claimed that they were so poor they couldn't afford anything. And unfortunately, I had a very fat, big mouth. And I said, well, you can afford to buy a swastika pin, but you can't afford, the books. You know how children are. Well, I presume that she went home and told her parents about it. She knew that I was Jewish. And it caused a great commotion with my parents, because they were afraid that the parents would report us, that there would be all kinds of repercussions. So my father had to go over and apologize to these people, which was very, very difficult, because, he practically had to beg them on his hands and knees to, not make any issue out of this. That was my very first experience, to keep my mouth shut, to observe and not say anything. That was the beginning.
Remember how you felt about that?
I felt terrible. I felt terrible because I was told about it. And I really felt bad, because I knew that it must have been dreadfully difficult for my father, even though I was that young. I realized there was something that wasn't right, that shouldn't have been done. But as a child, I was rather spoiled. I had 2 sets of grandparents. I more or less could do what I wanted to do. I mean, there was no difficulties of getting anything. There was nothing. So that I said what I thought, which is maybe normal for a child, but it was normal for me, and I should have known. And I learned real fast. Nazis were on the street, and naturally, at that time was the beginning of showing, of course, newspapers with caricatures of Jews, and Jewish businesses became, the target for stone throwing. various incidents that were beginning at that time.
What year?
That I would say that would all be 33, 34, 32, 33, 34. Hindenburg, I believe, came in 33, so it wasn't quite as obvious at that time, but it did become obvious as soon as he died and Hitler came to power. Then it really started. Children had to join the Hitler Youth. Sometimes parents were afraid of their own children because they were taught that, you have to obey. This is an Aryan country. The whole thing. And so you saw a lot of Hitler Youth. You saw kids came to school in their uniforms. And you were careful to keep away from them so that you weren't involved in anything. Plus, you saw more and more Nazis on the street in their uniforms. You began to hear about concentration camps. Very quietly, but you heard it. And the Jewish businesses were beginning to have Jews written outside on the glass overnight. It was scrubbed off the next day, but it was there, or it would be the Star of David would be on it, or people would stand in front of the business saying, "Don't come in here, don't buy, these are Jews." And so business was beginning to be very difficult also for
Was
us.
business affected like that?
Well, it was gradually beginning to be affected by it because some people wouldn't buy from him anymore but then you see he was in a wholesale business, so it wasn't on the street. It was in a big building. It wasn't one of those cases where people came up to see it. So he wasn't quite as concerned, but there was a lot of concern. Sometimes I wasn't in the room to hear about it all, but you heard it on the radio, you heard it, you saw it, and you knew what was going on. When I got to the Catholic school, I was sort of shielded from some of that because it didn't go on at school, and I really didn't, at school, I forgot that I was Jewish. I felt just like all the other children felt. I knew I was Jewish, but I also at the same time did what all children do. What do all children do at school? I mean, all children make the best of things, and they do things children do, like pranks at school, and I was always in amongst them, and invariably I got caught, and invariably I would come home and my parents would explain to me and say to me, "You're Jewish, you should know better than that. You shouldn't be involved. You know that things are difficult. You know that you could get into trouble. You know all these things."
Did you understand what they
Oh
were?
yes, I understood very well. But as soon as it came to something, I was right in it again. It was one of those things. That's my nature.
So, were you really afraid personally
No.
during that time?
No. I wasn't afraid in the beginning. I was afraid a little later on. One of the reasons I think why I wasn't afraid, I really and truly did not look that Jewish that people could actually say, "Yes, you're a Jew." Because, the people who really did look Jewish, of course, were immediately attacked on the street. But I didn't. I had braids, like all German children did, and I had braids around my ears, and I looked so
What
German.
color hair?
Brown.
Brown hair?
Yeah, brown hair. So I really, it would never have occurred to anybody to be Jewish, that I was Jewish, which maybe helped in one way, maybe didn't help in another way. My father felt that I should do everything that all other children do. I shouldn't be afraid, and I should stand my ground. It was a very good lesson because I did this all through my life. And so, for example, when you went to a park, when you went to the zoo, when you went anywhere on the benches it said, "No Jews allowed to sit here." And that was all over. Swimming pools were not allowed for Jews. Everybody else but not Jews. Being that I went to a Catholic school, I did go to the swimming pool because I went with my school, so I got to go. Others didn't. My father felt that I should sit on the bench just because it says that you shouldn't. Those were the things that was taught. But at that time, while I was at high school, I became friends with some Jewish children who belonged to the B'nai B'rith. And I was very impressed. They belonged to the B'nai B'rith, and there also was the Hashomer HaTzair, which is a group of people who do a lot of gymnastics. I believe that it's still around. I saw it some time ago. I think I saw the name of it. And since I was very athletic, I joined that as well. But you have to understand that none of the Jewish organizations were allowed. So of course you met in private and you met underground, so to say, because nobody was allowed. Jewish people were not allowed to have a gathering, particularly of a club, of an association that,
This was a gymnastics club?
This was not what you might think an athletic club. These were people who were very athletic, and that was their group. So that
They
we
had
met.
instruction in gymnastics?
No. They were just people who were interested in gymnastics,
And
But
they
they
performed?
met. Yeah, I believe they did perform somewhere, most probably, but I don't remember that. I only remember belonging to it, and remember that these youngsters got together and met. It's very exciting to go underground.
And, say more about that.
Well,
Describe where you met.
Well, we met in different people's houses, and of course you realize that when you go to these different houses, if there's a lot of Jewish people going in there, that's very obvious, so you had to be very careful. It's sort of an undercover type thing. But it's exciting. As a child, it's exciting, And of course my parents were very worried, but I went anyway. And we met, and I can't remember what all we talked about, but it was... Was
it us talking, or were people doing gymnastics?
No, they weren't doing gymnastics. No gymnastics. We had no place to do it in. But I did belong, and that was the first time I belonged to anything at all. I had never belonged to anything at all. Before that, clubs were not... They weren't as... what's the word? Predominant as they are here. Here, the high school clubs, kids belong to different organizations,
You said you were athletic. Did you play any sports?
Yes.
In grade school?
Yes,
or high school?
yes. Well, it's called Helga ball, which is a ball which is extremely heavy. It's almost like a medicine ball, a very hard ball, quite big. I would put it to, I suppose it's very similar to volleyball, only that you hit the volleyball with your hands, whereas this ball you throw with all your might. And if you hit somebody, it was a game that's very, very popular over there. And I played that, and I also did a lot of gymnastics on parallel bars and single bars and things like that. I was very, very gymnastic, lots of gymnastics.
Were you able to do that in high school?
Yes.
Even with the restrictions?
Yes. Well, because it was part of the curriculum, so there was no problem.
When you back to the anti-Jewish mandates,
Mm-hmm.
are you talking about the Nuremberg laws, for example, where it became more restrictive and Jews were not allowed
Correct.
to
Yes,
go to
yes.
public pools? And
Public pools, almost anything, it became more and more difficult. Anything that you could possibly think of, Jews were not allowed to do. Every day it was something else. Then one of the things that happened was that all Jews had to give up all their silver and gold. That was a mandate. I believe what they had to do at first, they had to write down what all they had, and of course they were afraid to lie. They were afraid to hide things. So then you had to gather that, and then you had to go somewhere and give it to them. That was one of the things that we had to do. And I remember I had gotten a gold watch for my birthday. It was the very first watch I had. And I was in tears. I had to give that up. Mind you, here I was in tears about a gold watch, and my parents had to give up everything.
how old were you, or what year?
I would say that I was about 13, 12 to 13.
1937?
36, 37, 13, yeah, 12 or 13. I was very upset. I didn't have it for very long. Also during that time, I was beginning to be more interested in being Jewish because you were somehow or other forced to. And then I realized, that things, that was part of my heritage and that I should do something about it. So I think in 1934-35 was the very first time that we celebrated Hanukkah. Up to that time, we always had a Christmas tree. Partially we had a Christmas tree because we had, my mother had help in the house. One of the things that you couldn't have anymore is you couldn't have help. Jews could not have help in the house. First they said, the help that comes into your house has to be over 40 years old. Sort of a joke now. After that, they said you couldn't have any help at all. So while we had help, we had a Christmas tree, and I thought that was wonderful, Then we started having Hanukkah. I remember my first Hanukkah. I thought that was very, very different, something that I didn't know anything about. Also, I had a girlfriend, we never celebrated Passover. And I had a girlfriend, and I was already in bed, and she called on the telephone that they were having Passover. And I believe there were going to be 13 people, and they didn't want 13 people at the table. So I got up and I went to Passover. That was my first Passover that I had ever seen. I'd never celebrated Passover.
Tell me about the 13.
I don't know why, but they didn't want 13 people at the table.
Because
So I think they must have been superstitious. I thought it had to do something with something religious. I don't know. But it was kind of interesting.
Back to your grandparents for a moment.
Yes.
When did was it your father's father that had died?
My father's father died when I was 2. So I only had a grandmother. And my grandmother had a sister and a brother. My uncle was a doctor, a very well-known doctor in Berlin, also in Berlin.
Your father's brother or your grandmother's?
No, my grandmother's. My father had no brothers and sisters. He was an only child. My mother had a sister, but my father was an only child as well. So I really come from a very small family. My aunt, my mother's sister, had no children. So there were no cousins on that side either. My grandparents, I don't ever remember them celebrating anything Jewish at all, ever, that I know of. I never saw it, nothing was ever said about it. We met at certain times. There wasn't a great relationship between my parents and my mother's parents. It was a very unfortunate thing, but they felt that my father wasn't good enough for my mother, and maybe he wasn't wealthy enough, wasn't this, wasn't that. So there wasn't a great love lost between them. So I was always afraid of my grandparents. They were rather standoffish and very strict, very, very strict. We did go there. My mother went every week to visit her mother, and I went. But I can't honestly say that there was a great lot of love lost between us. My father's mother was different. I was very fond of her. She was a wonderful woman, and she had been alone for many, many years. And she was a little involved in the business as well, because after all, it was her husband's business. So there was a great deal of love between us. And she was the one amongst the ones I saw last when I left.
You said that your ancestors were from Germany. How far back?
Quite a long ways. I believe there was somebody made what do you call that? When you go back and you have these trees of your family. Somebody in my mother's family did that. And as I understood, they went up to 1700. They really were very German. And this was one of the things that was very predominant with my father. He was German all the way through. And he had been in the war, he had fought, he had been in Russia, and so he felt German. And that was certainly, I felt that. We both, my mother felt it as well, and I could see no difference. I mean, you don't really think about this, that's how you're born, that's where you're born. And I loved Berlin. I mean, I was very happy there. But gradually, like I said, things were coming up, whispers about concentration camps.
So how did your father or your parents deal with this? They were Germans through and through in their beloved country, and this other thing was happening.
You know what they were feeling? They felt it would go away. This was a very great mistake. This was a big mistake of many, many, many people who were so, they would say, well, the world will not put up with this will go away, it can't go on forever, the man will die, it's this, it's that, it can't go on like this. There have to be changes. Nobody can go on like that, and it's just impossible. I mean, it'll go away. It'll go away.
Do you think they talked with other Jewish friends at the time?
Yes,
and
I'm sure.
Kind of agreed.
I'm sure, because I don't really know of anybody who survived.
Did they begin to hear of other Jews talking about leaving Germany?
Yes.
Okay, when
Yes.
do you remember
Yes.
hearing?
We talked about it. They were beginning to talk about it. Let me go back to something. 1936, we had the Olympics in Germany. And I went with my school to the Olympic Village and saw it. And it was a big thing in Germany, as you know. And at that time, a lot of the Jews felt that now that all these foreigners that were coming to this country, that they would see what was going on, they would see it with their own eyes, and surely something would be done about it. And at the same time, they also, the Nazis sort of laid a little low. They weren't quite as predominant about the Jewish pogroms as they had been. So everybody thought, this is it, things will get better, they're bound to get better. Well, of course they didn't, as you remember that Hitler would not shake the hand of Jesse Owens because he was black, and so all these things added up to it, and of course as soon as the Olympics were over with, things really started rolling. And at that time, I think, in 1936, I would say, my parents started to think about leaving. And Because for one thing, we had heard of people who had gone to camp, but nobody talked about it because they were told not to talk about it. An uncle of mine disappeared, but he did come back, but he never talked about it. We never found out what happened. Most people didn't at that time because they were threatened. My best girlfriend's father disappeared overnight, and it was horrible. It was just horrible. But he came back after about 4 days. Never found out what happened during that time. Never. She was my closest friend, and I really mourn her even today.
What was her name?
Dorothea, Dorla, we called her. And she was my closest friend, and I'll get back to that because I tried to get her out of the country after I left. So my parents started. They looked into Australia, they looked into New Zealand, looked towards America, of course. And the different countries had different entry examinations, as well as you couldn't just decide that you wanted to go to Australia. You had to, firstly, you had to go out into the wilderness in order to make a living there. They didn't want to have you, really. And you had to have a lot of money, of course, because they didn't want you to be a burden to the country. And so they applied and talked about it. But it was haphazardly, I would say. They talked about it, different people talked about it, but they made applications, they found out from other people what had happened. And America, I think my mother had a cousin here, and I think she wrote to him, but he told her that he wasn't in the position to do anything about it, and so that was out.
Any consideration of Palestine?
No. I hate to tell you this, but I think I should. My father felt very strongly that he did not want to live amongst his own people, which was which is very sad, but that is how he felt. He said, I will never, ever go to Palestine. Today, when I think about it, I would imagine so. I would imagine so. I know I heard him say it many, many, many times. Many times.
What was your reaction?
I didn't understand. I couldn't understand what the reason was. But at the same time, I figured he must have a reason. I didn't question. You mustn't forget, children in those days were seen and not heard. That is how I was brought up. You appeared and you disappeared. You did not question your parents at any time.
Were your parents strict?
Yes. My father was not there most of the time because he left for business in the morning. By the time he came home in the evening, I would usually have had my supper before they did and go to bed. So I didn't see a great deal of him, but I was extremely fond of my father. I was very close to my father. I admired him. Don't ask me why I admired him, but I did. I mean, he was my idol, always was. And I felt that that was his reasoning, there must have been a reason why.
Do you have any knowledge as to why you had no sisters or brothers?
I asked several times, and my mother said that they didn't think that the time was right to have more children, and maybe they were right. It was hard enough to let go of one child, leave alone more. But I asked a few times. But then, the majority of friends that I had, they were all only children. It was not, even my cousin was an only child. Most people that I knew in Germany, they didn't have that many brothers and sisters. It was usually you had one child, maybe two. Very unusual if you had more than that. I don't know whether that was the way it was or whether it was, well, let's think about it. My husband comes from a family of 10. In those days, he comes from Vermont, and in those days, everybody in town had a lot of children, you know. So that was very popular in those days, but with us it wasn't. So I didn't feel neglected, certainly. I was very lucky. I had everything. Everything. I didn't have to share. But I tell you what my parents did. Every summer, they sent me to camp for about a month or so.
From what age? When you were
Gosh, as long as I can remember, I would say, I think I must have started at 6 or 7. Every year I went to camp, not always the same camp, always different camps.
Where were the camps?
Oh, you know, different resorts, wonderful, what we call a Kinderheim, a children's home, it was called. Children from all over came, and you made friends. First, I wasn't so happy about leaving, but by the time I had fun. It was children, and, camp. Not camping as you're thinking of camping here. It was just a home, and lots of fun. It was a summer camp, strictly for the summer, and I was usually gone a month, which gave my parents a chance to get away. And I feel that having been sent to camp each year made it very much easier for me to leave Germany, because I had the experience of leaving. It wasn't the first time.
Were there Jewish children at the
Yes,
camps?
yes, there were Jewish children. I don't remember, in the end, I believe in that book, in 1936 and 35 and 37, 37, I went to Jewish camps. Then I didn't have any more choice. They were Jewish.
You had to?
Yeah, I had to. No other camp would take you. And I remember very distinctly that I went one year with my cousin, and it was a Jewish camp. And when we ventured to go outside the camp into town, we were stoned. People threw stones at us because we were Jewish.
How did they know?
They knew from the camp. They knew the camp was Jewish. They knew that we were all walking together. There was obviously that we were Jewish, and that was a great joke. I mean, it was a good pastime to throw stones against Jews. It's nothing unusual.
Did your Gentile neighbors begin to treat you differently?
No, never did.
In the apartment building?
Never did. Never did. Our neighbors were wonderful. As I've already told you, that we were the only Jews in the building. The people who lived below us, I think he was a dressmaker. He was in the business of making clothes. And they were very supportive of my parents, bought a lot of the materials. The neighbors we had next door, he was a dentist and his wife. And they were extremely supportive of my parents. And there wasn't anybody in the building that, felt any differently about us. Everybody was friendly, everybody, like I say, we were the only ones. And we were very low-key. This is one of the things that my parents always really instilled in me. Be low-key. Don't be braggacious. Don't make waves, in other words. Behave like you should behave. When we went away, we would always go on vacations, not only in the summer, but also at other occasions. Don't go to school and say, oh, we went here, we went there, we did this, we did that. Keep it low. And this is what we did. This is how we lived. And I presume we were very fortunate. The people who lived we lived in that apartment for many, many, many years. And that is where my parents left from. too. So, I mean, we weren't thrown out, or nobody said that you can't rent the apartment because you were Jewish. It was one of these situations. So, did you?
Did you have a question?
You said earlier that one of the reasons you didn't consider going to Palestine is because your father didn't want to live among his own people. Could you elaborate on that more?
Yes, I can. The business that he had was with materials, as I've stated, and he had quite a few customers who had material shops, who happened to have been Polish and Russian, of Polish and Russian descent, and
They were Jews.
they were Jews, and it seemed, at least this is the impression that I got at the time, because occasionally I would go with him to collect debts on Saturday afternoon, which was a big treat for me to go with him. Apparently the people didn't pay. And there were remarks made about Polish Jews and Russian Jews, and unfortunately I have to admit that there was no love lost between some of the German Jews and the others, and I'm afraid that German Jews have always set themselves up as being different, or in some way or form set themselves on a higher standard, because they were assimilated and they weren't Orthodox. Most of the German Jews that I knew were very liberal. And so therefore, maybe it seemed strange to them to see Polish Jews with pious on the side and long hair, and they felt that they weren't clean, and all kinds of things. It's an unfortunate thing, but that's the way it is. I was accused once, I remember meeting somebody, a girl that worked for me, and she was of Russian descent. And she mentioned it to me. She said, you know, you German Jews always thought you were so much better than we are, which really surprised me, because I had been so long in the United States and I didn't expect her to say something like that. However, she brought it home to me very clearly. And maybe it's so, I don't know. But that's the way I was brought up. That was the background that I had. You're German. You're German, and then you're Jewish. You're not Jewish and German, you're German and Jewish. That is your religion. It's not your country. And that's a definition that can be argued forever and ever, because, you know, some people feel I'm Jewish and I'm German, and some people feel I'm German and I'm Jewish. I always felt I'm German and I'm Jewish. And I've always felt that way, really. I really haven't changed that much. I mean, that's my heritage. Yes, my heritage is being a Jew. But my heritage is also, I was born in Germany, and that is where I came from. So, in that respect, you're quite right. There was a tremendous difference between Jews and Jews. Unfortunately, but it was a fact. So, and that again brought up certain situations where German Jews felt that other Jews did not behave the way they should. They were loud, they were aggressive, they were, they weren't behaving at that time. Instead of being low-key, they felt that they weren't, they shouldn't, I can't think of the words, they shouldn't really sort of make an issue of things that other people knew that they were Jewish. They should assimilate. Assimilation was a very big, important part in our life at that time. To keep low so that you wouldn't be taken, so that you can blend in with the rest of the people. While I was at school, I must say, I went to school. There were children with me, or girls with me in the class. It was a girls' school, of course. There were girls with me in the class that came from extremely wealthy parents. One of them owned a huge department store that was called C&A, which is very similar to what you had. I don't know whether you're familiar with C&A here, but it was a big department store. It had many, many stores, very wealthy. Basically, they were Dutch, but they all went to Catholic school. The ambassador from Belgium, the daughter went to school with me, was in the same class. So I would say it was a very elite school. I was very happy there. The nuns were wonderful. There was no definition between us. There was nothing. I wasn't any different than anybody else. Nothing was ever said if I wasn't good enough at school that, I'm Jewish and I should be better, I should do this, I should do that. That came from my parents. But unfortunately, I was rather, what would you call it, rambunctious. I wouldn't conform always to these things. And this is, again, something that I've tried to talk about in my speeches when I spoke about it, that children are children. They will make their own fun. They will do the best they can with what they have. So therefore, they don't always take into consideration what the seriousness is of the time that they're living in at that particular moment. It's extremely important so that you find that you can live, even though things are difficult. You still seem to produce your own environment of your, things that are very normal to you to children today were normal to me. You make it. You do it regardless. You don't always pay attention to what is going on. However, things got later in life. In 1938, let us go to 1938, because that was the very impressionable year and the very bad year. That was the worst year. It got worse and worse and worse. And by that time we knew about concentration camps. We had heard, we knew people disappeared, people were picked up. I saw people being beaten in the street. I heard people you could hear when they were pulled out of houses, out of their beds, you could hear it at nighttime when it was quiet. And I remember that one day I stood at the window and saw somebody being thrown out across the street, out of the window, and I was deathly scared. It was awful, just awful. During my school year, I had a lot of non-Jewish friends whose parents never gave it a thought that we were Jewish. I had birthday parties. These children appeared at my house. There was no being afraid or that they wouldn't come to my house. I never knew anything like it until 1938. 1938, by that time, my parents were really seriously thinking about leaving, trying to apply for visas to different countries.
More seriously than
Much
before.
more serious.
Which countries?
One of the countries that they had applied to was Chile. South America seemed to be the place where a lot of Jewish people seemed to be able to immigrate to much easier than any. America, unfortunately, was the most difficult, as we all know, and very, very strict. In fact, as you also know, that some people got turned back on ships, and it was far from easy to come to the United States. A lot of people went to Holland, a lot of people went to Belgium, and to France. At that time, my parents decided that it was time to send me out of the country. They felt there was no future, and they felt it would be easier if they left the country, that I would be somewhere else and wouldn't be going with them. So,
when did they tell you of this idea?
pardon?
When did they tell you?
I would say it must have been in probably the end of 1937, 38, because at that time children started to be sent to other countries, so that my father got in touch with a very good friend in England, and he asked him whether there was anything that he could do for us to leave the country. And he was a dentist, and he wrote back and he said, "I can do something for your daughter, but I cannot do anything for you because you are too old." England would take couples as servants. You could go as a servant couple. But in 1938, my father was too old. He was a year too old. My mother was 38. She was born in 1900. My father was born in 1893. He was already too old. You had to be, I think, 40. He was too old. So he said, "I can do something for your daughter, and I will see what I can do." So he started to get in touch with the Jewish organizations in England. And through a friend of his wife's, she managed to find a Jewish individual in England who would guarantee my coming to England. I never met the in-between person who was actually instrumental in this. It's really an unbelievable story. It was my father's friend's wife who had a mutual friend with a lady who guaranteed my coming over to England.
When you say guaranteed, does that mean sponsor?
She sponsored, yes.
What was the name of your father's friends in England? Do you remember?
No, I don't. I would have to look it up, and I really don't. To tell you the truth, I really don't remember.
How long did it take for this to get
This went
arranged?
on that was quite a while.
Over a year.
Oh, over a year, easily over a year, because letters went back and forth. She had to be, of course, I think she obviously belonged to some kind of an organization where she had to find out, they found out that she had enough money, that she could guarantee my living there, that I would not be a burden to England. And a lot of people did that.
Was she Jewish?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. She was Jewish. She was single. She was an older woman, and she had been a teacher. But for her, I wouldn't be sitting here, because she's the one who wrote then letters to my parents and said that she would be happy to take care of me, and you write back and forth to, what are you like, what can she expect, what could I expect. I wasn't thrilled about going. I didn't want to go to England. I wanted to go to France, because I spoke French fluently at that time, and I felt that I wanted to go to France rather than go to England, because some youngsters that I knew went to France.
So you knew other children that left?
That left,
families.
yes. And it's really amazing how lucky I was that I didn't go to France, because those children got caught. And so in that respect, it's really funny how life how life actually, can't think of the word, but how things happen in your life. What happens in your life without you having any jurisdiction over it. Can't make that. Now, going back to 1938, and so during this time, my father wrote back and forth, and
You knew this was happening.
I knew this was happening. In 1938, the school started to say that Jewish children could not go to non-Jewish school. But being that I went to a convent school, the convent said, it doesn't make any difference. This is the way things are. We have these children here. They go to school here. We do not observe these kind of rules and regulations. They are our children. They are paying. Of course, this was an expensive school. You have to pay for going to school in Germany. I don't know how it is now, but it's quite expensive. And they will stay. My father had a cousin who left Germany in 1933 and went to England. She had a doctorate in chemistry, and she kept telling my father, you must leave, you've got to leave, you've got to leave. But she was on her own, and when my father approached her, she really wasn't in the position to guarantee a living for me, since she was on her own. She had gotten a lab of her own and was working doing research work. So 1938, the 9th of November, the famous night, the Kristallnacht, was a night that actually all hell broke loose. We knew something was happening, but didn't know what. We had a feeling, everybody had it. Something was coming, but nobody knew what it was.
You could feel it.
You could feel it, you knew there were indications were being made. There were all kinds of things seemed to lead up to something big was going to happen, but nobody knew what. And then we were at home, and when we got up the next morning, Kristallnacht had happened.
You didn't hear anything?
I don't remember that I heard anything because, no, I didn't hear anything because there was nothing happening in our house. It was mainly the synagogues. You got up in the morning and the first thing you heard was that all the synagogues had been burned. And glass, the Kristallnacht, all the synagogues in all of Germany had been destroyed. And that is when people really realized that things were really much, much worse than they had any idea, or what they believed, what they didn't want to believe that was happening. Then they knew. As of that day, when I went to school, I was told there was no way that I could go back to that school. The school, they were told by the German government, you will throw all Jews out of school, because if you don't, you will go to the concentration camp and the schools will be closed. So they really didn't have much choice. It could not be expected that Gentile people could possibly sit next to Jews. Jews could not sit next to Gentiles. Why? Nobody knew. But it couldn't be expected that these people could possibly go to school with us. I mean, So as of that moment, I had no school. What happened after the Kristallnacht is that we fled our apartment because we felt that it wasn't safe to live there, because, of course, the government knew where we lived. And we went from different to different friends, night after night. Some of them were Jewish friends, some of them were, no, not Jewish friends, non-Jewish friends. We would stay there overnight, just for the night, so that we wouldn't be at nighttime in our apartment. Because everything that happened always happened at nighttime, not during
I
the
see.
day.
So you went to the apartment during the day, but not at night.
That's right.
Did you actually see any of the broken glass and the destruction?
I seem to remember some of it, yes. I think we did go to the synagogue to see it. It was frightening. It was really frightening. It's one of those feelings where you know there's something going on, but you don't really know what it is. You're just very, very scared. And that was at a time when I really felt that now it was coming to the point where maybe I would lose my parents. Who knew? At that time, my father also lost his business. He had to give up the business. Jews just weren't allowed to have any more business. Doctors were not allowed to treat Gentile people. My uncle started to make inquiries to leave the country, and he was fortunate enough to have several ambassadors from Berlin, from different countries, that he treated as patients. So he was fortunate enough to have the Portuguese ambassador. He was instrumental enough to give him a visa to go to Portugal with his family. And during that time, I was then enrolled in a Jewish school. Well, of course, you realize that when you go to a Jewish school, you're a target. You're always a target if you're amongst Jews. If you're on your own, you're not a target. But if you're with others, you're a target.
The summer camp.
Like the summer camp. And so I went to a Jewish school, and I was very happy. And I had my first boyfriend there, which was, a thrill. He was Jewish. I didn't have to worry. There were no restrictions given to me. And again, a Jewish school, and somehow or other we all had the same fun that other people have at school. We made we got together, we had birthday parties, we had other parties. It was just the difference that we were all Jewish.
Were people talking about leaving, though, amongst the...
Some of them were leaving, yes. Yes, they were. Everybody was leaving sooner or later. But, and my boyfriend was going to go to Sweden. And it was wonderful. I had a wonderful time, even though things were so difficult. I have to tell you a little incident that happened while going back to camp, in the Jewish camp. I was friendly with a boy who was of Polish descent. And we wrote to each other after I got out of camp, after we went back to our homes. And one day I decided that I would go and see him.
Where did he live?
He lived in Berlin, other part of Berlin, quite a ways away. My parents didn't know. And I talked to him on the phone, and I said, I'd really like to see you. Well, anyway, I took off on the underground or on the bus, I don't remember. It was quite a ways.
When was this, do you remember?
It was probably 1937. And got to his house, and he wasn't there. So I left a photograph of myself, and I put it through the mail slot. And when his mother found it, she thought that I was one of the German Hitler Youth children, because I had braids. I had a sweater that was very popular at that time, being worn by some of the girls, and she tore it up. I thought that was very amusing, to think that I was not Jewish, and that I guess he got into a lot of trouble because she was under the impression that he had been going out with somebody who was not Jewish. But anyway, going back to 1938, went to the Jewish school, and things got closer and closer as far as going to England for me. Children were leaving, and they were leaving on children's transports. which I know you're familiar with. And
Could you describe it?
the children's transports were children who were going to go to England and who had been guaranteed a living in England. All I knew is that I would have a guardian who would take care of me, just like my parents did. That is what she had told my parents. And that is what she did. However, other children were not as fortunate as I was. They were called, some of them were called house daughters. The house daughter then turned out to be the maid, but I was lucky again. Anyway, she promised my parents that she would take care of my parents until they got to another country. And then, of course, I would join the parents to in the country that they were going to immigrate to, which was Chile. I knew that. By that time, they had gotten their visa, and things were going along slowly, but they were going along. One of the things that I should mention to you at that time is that in order to know that you were Jewish, the German government said that every Jew had to have a photograph taken as a card. What do you call them? Yeah, identification. They also got a name. Every Jewish man, besides his name, had the name of Israel. Whatever you know him as, Eric, Israel. First name, second name was Israel. Women had to have their picture taken from the side with their hair behind the ear. So I presume that you could see the profile very well. So if you had, God forbid, a Jewish nose, it was very obvious you were Jewish if you had to show your card. Every woman's name was Sarah, including myself, of course. So, when you gave your name, it had to be your name plus a Jewish name.
You gave your name first.
Your name first, and then the second
Sarah.
name was Sarah.
And then, was there a J on the passport as well, or on the card?
I would imagine it was. I don't remember my card. I don't remember a card, but I was still young enough. But I know my parents had. I'm sure they did. Well, things were progressing towards my leaving. Other people, some of my friends had left already, and my mother would, whenever we heard of a transport, the transports didn't go every day. I mean, it was so many children had to come from all over Germany that had to be all arranged so that they would all go at the same time. And my mother would keep asking me, have you heard of anybody going? And I had a friend whose father apparently was instrumental in that organization when children were leaving. So he knew a little bit more about it than what I would. And I said, no, I didn't know. So I went to school most probably until sometime in the beginning of 1939, because I left Germany June the 6th, 1939. June the 6th, 1939. So I would say that I went to school maybe till February or March in the Jewish school. And then my parents decided, in order for me to learn a little bit more English, they would send me to an intensive course, which was a course of about 6 weeks of somebody constantly speaking English to you. It was like a Berlitz school. And my girlfriend went with me as well.
Which friend?
My very closest friend,
Dorothy.
Dorothy. And we both went to school, and again, it was one of those situations where there were adults and there were youngsters. By that time I was 15. and we learned English. What I really learned more than anything else, although I had had some English at school, is that you got used to the sound of English. Not so much the words, but the sound, how you sound, so that when you get to the country, it doesn't seem so strange to you. And then finally the papers came through. And I was to leave the 6th of
How
June.
much notice did you have?
I think we most probably had about a month, not a great deal of time, but during that time my mother did get things ready for me and what was to get, what clothes I was to wear.
You could take things with you?
Yes, I could take some things with me and the rest of the things were being sent to me then later on. I did take some things with me. Not a lot, because as a child you can't carry very much. Money, I cannot remember how much money we were allowed to take. Very little, I'm sure, because as you well know, that when Jews left Germany, they went without money. No money was to go out of the country. If they were fortunate enough to have money in other countries that they had been able to smuggle through, or jewelry, they had something, but not otherwise. I won't forget the day that I left. My father, my mother, and my grandmother took me to the station. And I must say to you that I cannot, in my wildest dream, imagine what my parents must have gone through. To give up your only child and not know whether you see her again, although I personally didn't think about that I wouldn't see them again. It didn't even occur to me. During that time, all these things were going on between Czechoslovakia and Germany, and Germany had already taken over the Sudetenland, they had already taken over Danzig, they had already taken over Austria, they had taken over part of Czechoslovakia, they had taken over Alsace-Lorraine, so the handwriting was certainly on the wall. But I thought, well, my parents would be able to go to Chile. I would see them there again, and I had been to camp, so it wasn't any big deal that I would leave. I maybe would be there 6 months, maybe not even that long. Nothing was being said about how long you were going to be there. So they were all at the station, and we got on the train. There were lots of children, and I don't remember that there was anybody that I knew. I think I was on my own. But it was a very exciting time, and there were parents and there were tears, and it was a very emotional time. And I looked at my grandmother and I thought to myself, she was 71 or 72, a very young 71.
Your father's mother?
My father's mother. My grandparents by that time had died. They were dead. They had died a natural death, so there was no problem there. And of course, I had all kinds of instructions, how to behave, how to do this, how to do that. I have letters from my father still that I kept that tell you, you should thank everybody, you should do this, you should do that. And then my father decided that the train was going to stop at another station. So we had a car, and he would drive the car to the other stations just so that he could see me one more time at the next station. And that upset me, because I didn't think that he would make it and that I would see him again. And he was the most important part of my life. My mother was very nice, but there was no very close relationship between myself and my mother. And I realize in today's times that it was partially because it was the same relationship as her mother. The relationship was not close. It was, her sister was a preferred person, and my mother was not close, so she didn't know how to be close with me either. She really didn't know how to react, actually to to have a relationship with a 15-year-old. We all do, but she didn't. And besides that, the difficulties that she had to go through, the life that she was leading, to be constantly afraid. Would she see my father? Would he go out of the house? Would she see him again? These are all things that I didn't take into consideration at that time. She also got very, very ill. She had diphtheria, had to be isolated. I had to leave the house.
When?
In 1938. She was very, very ill, and my grandmother took care of her, and I lived with my uncle, who was a doctor, because you couldn't stay with somebody, you were infectious. Well, fortunately, my father did make it to the next station, which was very important. I wanted to see him the last.
Just him or all of them?
Just him. And I left. And I can't tell you very much about the trip, but we were on the train, and when we got to the border, I remember I was scared to death, because the German border guard came in. They knew we were all children. They knew we were all Jewish. And I wasn't sure whether we would be harassed to the point that maybe we didn't make it out of the country. And what they did is they took our suitcases, opened the suitcases to make sure that we hadn't smuggled anything, took everything out, threw everything out, made it very difficult. But the train was leaving, so they didn't have a lot of time, but they had enough time to make it very difficult.
Were there any adults chaperoning?
I don't remember. I doubt it. I was 15 by that time. There may have been. I don't remember. There must have been, because how would we have known where to go and what to do? Must have been some kind of, there must have been somebody, but if there was, I don't remember. And we went from Berlin, we went by train to the Hoek van Holland. We went to Holland. In Holland, we picked up the ferry, and I remember I was up at the top. It was in the evening. We arrived in the evening, and I had a bunk up on top. Now, how friendly I was with children, I don't know, but I'm sure we were. Everybody talked, everybody knew where they were going. The horrible part is you're going to a strange country, you're going to meet somebody completely new, you're going to speak a different language, and you don't know what to expect. So we went by boat from the Hoek van Holland to Harwich.
How long overnight?
That was overnight. It isn't very far, the channel isn't that far to cross. Nowadays you do it by hovercraft. It doesn't take very long. That took the whole evening, the whole night. You got up there in the evening, went to bed, and the next morning we arrived about 6 o'clock in the morning. We arrived at the Hoek van Holland, and there was a train waiting for us to take us to London. The children that I was with must have all gone to London. Or if they didn't, they must have gone on to London and then on to other places from London. But the Jewish organization did meet us at the train. It was very well organized, because the people were, whoever had a guarantor, those people were there, and they were told, as your name was called, then that person came forward, and you met them. Now, I had no pictures, no photographs of this person, and my first impression was a typical English spinster. She had not been married. I mean, typical. Anything that I could think of that I would imagine in my imagination of somebody being a teacher, that most of us never thought much of teachers. They weren't really the greatest people we thought of. You didn't associate with teachers. This was a teacher. She was retired. She was English. And she wasn't married.
And how old was she at the time?
She must have been about 50, an older woman. How could she possibly relate to me?
And what was her name?
Her name was Esther Salaman,
Spelled last name.
Salaman. As a matter of fact, I found some letters the other day. She saved my life. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman. But I personally wasn't that terribly fond of her. She couldn't really relate to me. I couldn't really relate to her, but it was her responsibility that she must take care of me, and that is what she did 100%. I arrived. She knew some German. She was very wealthy. She knew some German, so she tried to speak German to me, and I remember we went to Hyde Park and we had tea and cucumber sandwiches. And then she took, after that we went to the apartment. She had a lovely apartment.
In London?
In London, in Putney. And I had my own room. And of course it was very difficult because, I understood what she said to a certain extent, but I couldn't make myself understood. I can't imagine what she must have felt. I know what I felt, but I can't imagine what she must have felt. A strange child, never had any children. How do you do that? Anyway.
What did you feel at the beginning?
I felt desolated. I felt I was alone. Which way would I turn? What would I do? And who would I talk to? Except the man who was instrumental in guaranteeing my way coming over, who was instrumental to finding this person. I knew that those were friends of my father's, and I knew that I would be in touch with them at all times, which I was. This was 6th of June, 1939. And the first thing that my guardian did is enroll me in school. The school that I went to had guaranteed my being able to come to the school, and they paid for everything. I was the first refugee child. I was a refugee. I was a Jewish refugee. And they guaranteed my coming to school. They bought the school uniforms for me. In England, you wear a school uniform. They paid for everything. They paid for my going to school, because people who can afford to go have to pay. People who can't afford to, they get some kind of a grant, I believe. Well, anyway. And my guardian felt that I should go to school as quickly as possible in order to learn English, to learn to speak English. So there was somebody living in the same apartment complex who was a youngster who was going to that school, and she introduced me to her. And this girl started talking to me, and it was just like one babble to me. Children speak very fast. I just looked at her, and I decided that the best thing to do is always shake your head and say yes, and smile. And if it doesn't work out and they look at you funny, then you say no, and you shake your head. You'd be surprised how well that works. Anyway, she said she would take me to school, and she would, Anyway, all the friends that my guardian had were teachers. And so a lot of those teachers were at that school, who then took over and took me in and introduced me to the children. What I had to do at that time was, I spoke better French than I did English. So I took a French class, and so what I had to do in the French class, I had to translate the French that the teacher spoke into German, and the German I had to translate into English. It was difficult. It was very difficult. And I felt lost, very lost. My guardian tried to be, she was very kind. I was very lost. Everything was strange. I had never eaten cereal. And she presented me with cereal, and I didn't know what it was. Never eaten that, never seen it before. What is it? Lots of things that that I had never seen before, wasn't used to, and I was used to my food, and they eat differently, and so there were a lot of difficult things.
Plus, you were a teenager.
I was a teenager, but, I was just 15. So gradually, I got used to the children in my class, and they were very kind. They thought it was kind of fun to take somebody over. So I gradually learned to speak very quickly.
Did they go to school during the summer?
No. Yes, they must have gone to school at that time, because I tell you what, you have 3 months school vacation here. You don't have that kind of school vacations in England or Germany. In Germany, you used to have 6 weeks only. So when I came in June, I don't think I got out of school maybe until July. I also remember that my guardian, the first thing she did 2 days after I had arrived, she made me go to a store and buy some food for her. And she handed me the money. And the money was horrible because it was in pounds. And in those days, the pound had 20 shillings to the pound. Now it's in hundreds. It's different. But at that time, you had to figure 20 shillings to the pound. You had to figure out how much the money was. And she sent me to the store, and I said, I can't possibly do that. And she said, you must. So I went. She wrote down what she wanted. So I went to the store, and I put the money in my hand, and I held it out like that, and hoped for the best, that the man would take the right money and would give me the right change, which he did. She was really very good in teaching me. So I learned very quickly in a very short time. When children go to school, even today, any child that comes over as a youngster into a different country and learns a different language learns extremely fast, because people talk to you constantly, and you get the drift of things. And kids, will explain to you what it is.
Did you hear from your parents in the
Yes. During all that time, I had letters. We wrote back and forth, and I have some of the letters. I saved some of the letters. And yes, we wrote back and forth. I explained, what kind of life I had, and who I saw, and that I saw the friend, and all I had in every letter. Be sure to be grateful. Be sure to say thank you. Be sure to behave yourself. Be sure to do this. It was constant. And I wasn't exactly the tidiest girl in the world, so my parents had told me to, be sure to keep my room clean, which of course I did for a little while, and then I got the same thing, and my guardian couldn't understand that, but she had a maid, so it wasn't so bad. Anyway, one of the reasons why my name Mickey appeared was that English people have a very difficult time in pronouncing an H. It's not very easy for them. So it became that instead of calling me Helga, they called me Olga, which was easier for them to pronounce. At that time, there was a saying that they used to say Olga the Volga. And I hated that. In between time, I managed to go to English movies, which weren't really English movies, they were American movies. And I remember my first American movie was Ramona, with Cesar Romero and Donna Michi, which was probably before your time. But I was very impressed. That was a color movie, and I went to England, and I saw all these wonderful movies. And at that time, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland were very, very popular. And I would see the movies. I was so impressed that my guardian would let me go to a movie, because I wasn't allowed to go to the movies in Berlin. I was only allowed if it was a movie that was for children. And not over 13, you couldn't go, and it was all a different lifestyle altogether. I mean, had freedom, basically freedom that you don't really call freedom, but to me it seemed like freedom that I wasn't told all the time, yes, you can go to the movies, yes, you can do things that you couldn't do before. And I was very impressed with Mickey Rooney. And so people kept saying, I would say, please don't call me Olga. Well, what shall we call you? I said, why don't you call me Mickey? That is how my name stayed forever and ever. It's Mickey, 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 because it was so easy. Well, I think in July of 1939, of course things got worse as far politically was concerned, and it looked very scary, and my parents kept writing to me that they were getting ready to go to Chile, that their permit had been given to on the 8th of September of 1939. They were going to leave for Germany, for Chile, South America, and I thought that was very exciting. And while I was going to school, my guardian decided that it would be a good idea if I would go to Cambridge University, because she was a graduate from Cambridge University and I should do the same thing. So you know how wealthy she was and how she felt that that is the kind of education I should have. By that time, I felt that I had graduated. I hated school. That was the last thing on my mind, to go to university. I thought it was horrible. I said, there's no way that I will go to university. So I was going to the secondary school, and vacation had started. We went away on vacation, and when I came back, it must have been about August, it looked like war would break out. And the London County Council decided that children should not be in London because there was going to be bombing, and the children should be evacuated. Schools should be evacuated into the country. So I think it must have been just about the end of August when all these arrangements were being made, and the war broke out. September the 2nd, 1939. And I knew of that day that my parents wouldn't make it out of Germany. They wouldn't be allowed to leave. As of that day, all correspondence stopped. And I was evacuated with my school, once again, to strange people, leaving the place that I had known just for a short while, leaving the person that I had known just for a short while, and went with my school, and I was evacuated. And the first people that we lived with, I went with my friend from the class, was a Methodist minister.
Where?
In the country.
Where?
Byfleet, in London, outside London, in Surrey. There were 4 of us the first night. And we were staying, this was just before we got to the minister, because it was just for one night that we stayed at somebody else's house. And they didn't have a bathroom. They had an outhouse. And all of us were afraid to go outside into the dark. I mean, I came from Berlin to London to all of a sudden the country and nobody that you knew. So when we were evacuated to the minister, he was wonderful. They had 2 children, well, there were 2 of us, and you know, I became the best little Methodist you had ever met in your life.
Was it a farm?
No, it was a home, and he was a wonderful man, and you know, there was nothing to do, so on Sunday you went in the morning to church, and you went in the evening to church, and you got to learn all the songs. I was just like everybody else. You do what you do.
Someone else at his
Yes,
house?
I was with another girl from my class.
What was her name?
Can't remember.
Was she Jewish?
No. I don't remember there were any Jewish children in that school. There must have been, but I don't think so.
When you say children, were you with children your own age?
Yes,
or?
yes, from my class. See, I was in the grade that I was in was the same youngsters that were the same age as mine.
And how about on the train? What were the ages on the kinder transport?
I would imagine about the same age. They wouldn't have been too young, because you couldn't send you couldn't send children out that would have to be taken care of by other people unless they were relatives. That I remember, most of us were. I think I was one of the youngest. There were maybe some that were 16. I was 14, 15, and 16, I would say. Maybe 17. But that's the age that I seem to remember. Most of the people that I knew were about my age. So when I was evacuated, the London County Council paid for our staying with these people. They got extra money. And while I was going to school, the Methodist minister's wife got pregnant. And so she decided that besides her own 2 children and being pregnant, she really couldn't take care of 2 more children. So once again, we had to be moved. And in order to be moved, we had a billeting officer who made sure that we had homes. That was her responsibility, to find places for us. So this girlfriend and myself went to somebody else's house, and we had our room there. And of course, during the day we went to school, So
What kind of a school?
It was the same school that I went to. It was a regular school. It was the same school that I went to in London, only they were evacuated to outside London. You see, the schools were...
Also.
The teachers also. Oh, yes, all the teachers. So really and truly, I just continued with the same children, with the same teachers that were friends of my guardians, but strange people. Strange people who didn't know anything about refugees, didn't know anything about Jewish people. They were people who lived in the country. They weren't interested. They were not, they didn't know anything about that. So here I was. I was German. I was Jewish. I was a refugee, and I didn't speak much English. And I was an enemy alien. So I had 5 strikes against me. Well, the people that we stayed with, I didn't like. I felt that they were, well, for one thing, the food that they gave us, they didn't give us much food. We were already on rationed food because, the war had broken out. And she kept a lot of the coupons for herself and for her family rather than us, and I was very unhappy there. So I went to the school and I said, I don't want to live there anymore. And they said, we're very sorry, but there's no place that you can go to. If you want to go somewhere else, you're going to have to find your own housing. So I thought to myself, fine, I'm not going to stay here anymore. So I went to the area where we were living, and I started going from house to house. And I knocked on the door. And people would answer, and I would give them the spiel that, I was at school and that I needed a place to stay. They knew that they would be paid. They knew all that. And I went into a very lovely district, and would you believe, I came across somebody who said, my dear, we don't have children and we are very quiet people. And it was a lovely house, and I looked at her and I said, I am so quiet, you wouldn't believe it. And she said, well, we talked, and she said, we read a lot. And I said, I read a lot too. Anyway, I sold myself. And she said, well, I have to talk to my husband. We're really not used to children. And I said, believe me, I said, you won't be sorry. And so she said, I'll let you know. And do you know, I stayed with these people, and they became, without a doubt, the most wonderful people I have ever met in my whole life. They were wonderful. Actually, they were more wonderful than my guardian.
And what were their names?
Sears, Mr. and Mrs. Sears. They were absolutely wonderful. I matched so well into their home, and she was so kind, and I kept saying to her, I hate to say thank you all the time. She was so understanding. They were just absolutely wonderful. I kept in touch with her. I saw her in England till she was 93 years old. She was just wonderful. And it got to the point that even on my vacations I would go and see her rather than my guardian. That's how close I was with them. I mean, she was like my second mother. And I stayed with them. I had a wonderful life.
How old were they at that time?
She must have been in her 40s. They were a little old. They were younger than my guardian, but still they were in their 40s. And they were very quiet people. And of course, I wasn't really as quiet as I told them I was. And I got them to do things that they had never done before. Didn't go to the movies. They didn't, a lot of things that they got them to do. It was wonderful. I had a wonderful life there.
How long
And
did you stay?
I'm trying to think. There was in 1939, 1940. I most probably stayed with them maybe a year or so, because then I graduated from my secondary school and my guardian enrolled me in a trade school. I felt that she felt, being that my mother was such a wonderful seamstress, that I should become a seamstress, which I hated. I wanted to become a hairdresser. And so she said that hairdressers was not a job for me, that was, low class. And what would my parents feel if I became a hairdresser? And I said I couldn't see any difference. But then I did write to my father. And the way I wrote to my parents was through my boyfriend in Sweden. I would send the letter to him in Sweden, then send the letter to Germany, because Sweden was not at war. And that is how I got my mail.
So you
At
did
that
hear-
time.
You did hear from them?
Yes. And he said, of course, it was outrageous that I could even think of becoming a hairdresser. How could I even think of such a thing? Couldn't I become a dental assistant? Because that's what he wanted me to be. Well, anyway, I was enrolled in the school, and I learned ladies' tailoring. And once again, the school was evacuated somewhere else, so again, I had to move. Again, I had to go to somebody new.
Originally, it was in London?
Originally it was in London, but it had also been evacuated and was a different area where my secondary school was. So
Was there any bombing during the time you were in London?
no.
Did you
No, I left London before the bombing started. Bombing started much later, and while I was at the trade school, which was somewhere in 1940, 41, because I signed up in the service in 1941.
What did you hear from your parents about what
At
was
that
going on
time,
in
they
Germany?
didn't see a great deal. They would write that things were all right, that my dog was all right, mostly instructions what I should be doing and what I shouldn't be
Did you
doing.
know if they were in danger?
I knew that through politically. They didn't write it. They would always say, we're all right. My grandmother left her apartment and moved in with them, but they would say things like, Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so are doing very well and they've been very nice to us, or we've gotten together with so-and-so and so-and-so.
Were they still living in the same apartment?
Yes,
That night as well?
yes. They stayed there till 1942, I believe, 42, 43. They were there the very last. What I found out afterwards is that my father learned welding. And the welding that he had to do is he had to take down the gates of the Jewish cemetery. The other things that I learned after the war is that my father was one of the people who had to pick up other Jews, which was really pretty awful for me to think about. But then I suppose in order to survive, you must probably do almost anything. And I was so shocked when I heard it. But it didn't help, because in the end he got picked up anyway. But, you wonder, what would you do in the same situation? what do you do if you want to survive? What do you do for your family? How far do you go? And how far do you go to do something for somebody else? I don't know. I can't imagine what must have gone through his mind. Anyway, I went to this trade school, and the area that I was in Maidenhead in England, then the bombing started and we could see London burning. It wasn't that far away from London, but far enough so that we wouldn't be in the bombing itself. Bombing was terrible. It was dreadful, but you could see London burning. And again, I was with people who would say to me, "You're an enemy. You're Jewish, you're German, and you're a refugee." And then they would say, "Well, about Jews," I was always with people who weren't Jewish, and they would say, "But you're different." And I would say, "Explain to me what different means. Why am I different from other people?" And they could never explain that to me. You're different. I think what they meant is that, once again, I had assimilated to the way things were, that I don't know what their perception of Jews was. I don't know what their perception of Germans was. This was not London. This was outside London. These were people who were ordinary people who did not, most probably had their own friends, didn't have anything to do with Jewish people, didn't have any inclination what it was like.
So then you were different than the stereotype.
That's exactly the right wording. The stereotype. I don't know what their stereotype was. English Jews are different than German Jews. English Jews are different than American Jews. They're different. All of us are different, but different countries are different altogether. Anyway, I went to that school and I graduated from the school.
The tailoring school.
The tailoring school. I graduated. And during that time, a lot of the refugees were being interned on the Isle of Wight. A lot of the German refugees were interned, and some of the people were sent into factories to work. And I didn't want to do that. So I signed up in the army. And I was 17 and a half years old.
Did you tell anybody you were going to
No.
do that?
But I had to have permission from my guardian, but I didn't tell her until after I had already signed up.
What did she say?
First she was against it, and then she said, well, I insisted that I wanted to go, and she decided that she wondered what my parents would say about it. But then I was so adamant about it that she said, fine, I will sign that you can go, but once you go, you're on your own. Once you're in the service, you're in the service. You can't get out.
And your reasons of signing up?
I tell you what my reasons were. My reasons were that I wanted to do something for England. I was very patriotic, and I felt if I could help to beat the Germans and beat what was going on, then it was my responsibility to do so.
So your identity had shifted.
Very much so. My identity then became English. My guardian had introduced me to all different kinds of things, good music. I mean, it was a wonderful life. I was very lucky. I had a very, very good life. I've been very fortunate. And so I signed up in the army, and I was 17 and a half. And lo and behold, by the time I got to the station to meet all the others, every one of us was a refugee. We were in an outfit that was strictly what they call an allied platoon. We had Austrians, Germans, Hungarians, Italians, and most of us were Jewish. It was an experience I will even today, that's where I grew up, in the army. Those were my friends, and I still have them today. It was an experience that was wonderful because we all came from the same backgrounds. And all of us felt the same way. And most of us, I was the youngest, but most of them had been more or less in the same situation, had either come over on a children's transport or they were house daughters. Some of them had very bad situations and couldn't wait to get away from their families, where they were made to scrub floors and all sorts of things. And I was very lucky. I went to school, I had a wonderful life, I went on vacations, anything you can think of. So, even though that things were difficult for me, I was lucky. I was very, very lucky. And I was in the army from 1942 until 1945. And that's where I met my husband. And guess what? He was Catholic. Can, if you want to.
Interview with